way about this building, but I do want to share a little bit about the building. Totally with donated monies from our families, from our community, from our supporters, which makes it very special to me, and it's absolutely gorgeous, isn't it? Yeah. It's gorgeous. And I always say about this building, it is absolutely beautiful, but what's beautiful are the things that happen inside this building. So since opening in July, we've had over 40 families coming and staying here. There are suites for them to stay and be with their loved ones who go to school here, so that's a wonderful thing. We've had a Thanksgiving supper for all the children who are unable to go home, and we have this meeting today. So, and good things will happen. We always feel at Springbrook that we only succeed if our area succeeds. We are partners in everything that happens in this area, and we're so proud that we had our start in Otsego County and will continue in Otsego County. So welcome. After this is over, if you'd like a tour of the facility, we'd certainly love to be able to do that for you. So Jim?
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks to all of you for coming here on what is so far the coldest morning of the year. No snow, thankfully. Yes, there is some snow. All right. First, I'd like to recognize the folks who are the focus of this meeting, who this meeting really is all about, our county board of representatives. All the folks who will stand as I introduce you. First, our chairman of the board, Kathy Clark. Our vice chairman, Ed Frazier. And then we'll try to do this in sequence. Michelle Farwell from District 2. Andrew Stanton, District 4. Margaret Kennedy, District 5. Bill O'Brien, District 6. David Bliss, District 7. Andrew Marietta, District 8. McCarty, Gary Kotnick, Adrian Martini, District 12, Danny Lappin, District 13, and Kay Stuhlegros, District 14. She is such, actually she's an honorary guest. And she will be succeeded in District 14 at the end of the year. Liz Stanton. I would also like to introduce our honorary hosts who helped bring this great crowd out here today, and I appreciate all of you being here. Danielle Henrici from Nisha, Chairman Gary Herzig, the Mayor of Oneonta. Retired Assemblyman. Dr. Davey, representing Senator Jim Seward. Victor Kuzminski from Sustainable AllOTSEGO. There I see Ellen Telepot representing the village of Cooperstown. Still our honorary guest, our honorary host. Now there are other honorary hosts here scattered throughout. If I missed any of you, would you raise your hand? Okay, well, thank you very much, and again, welcome. In introducing our moderator today, there are many accomplishments I could mention. I could talk about Hartwick College's first-of-a-kind 3-year degree, or about the Innovative Center for Craft Food and Beverage. I could talk about the college's record-breaking $33 million fund drive. I could talk about our national leadership on boards of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities and the NCAA Division III President's Council, for the U.S. Senate Bipartisan Task Force on Government Regulation of Higher Education, and that's just a start. It goes without saying that she came to Harvard College 10 years ago, highly educated, highly experienced, highly accomplished. But all of that misses what most sets Margaret Griffith apart. She is best in crises. Put another way, you might say she is at her best when things are at their worst. When the Great Recession struck in 2008, she acted forcibly, effectively, and humanely, not only to preserve but to strengthen the important local institution she leads. When freshman enrollment dropped 1 year, she put in place cutting-edge techniques to ensure that the following year, enrollment goals were exceeded and since maintained. When SUNY's Excelsior scholarships, free tuition at public colleges, threatened to divert students from quality private liberal arts schools like Harvard, she introduced Founders Awards, annual $10,000 grants to every New York State student who enrolls. Most astonishingly, coming out of years of recession, she found the funding and oversaw the planning, and in recent weeks, the completion of a $67 million pedestrian-friendly renovated campus on beautiful Ayari. When people go negative, she goes positive. When others see problems, she sees challenges to be overcome. Where others waver, she goes forth boldly and cheerful to slay the dragon of the day. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Harvard College President, Margaret Griffith.
Wow, what a nice introduction. Thank you. That's one for the record books. I like that. Well, I am so proud to have been invited to come and moderate this important session this morning. And we have as our speaker someone who's uniquely prepared to address the questions that we'll be discussing this morning, Dr. Gerald Benjamin. I want to take a few moments and give Dr. Benjamin a proper introduction. Because I think that it's really important for me to be able to establish for you, if you've not been able to review his background, just how really qualified he is to lead us in this conversation. But Dr. Benjamin was appointed the Associate Vice President for Regional Engagement and the Director of the Benjamin Center at SUNY New Paltz in 2008. The Benjamin Center is the principal locus of the college's efforts to raise its level of engagement within community, government, with not-for-profits, and with businesses across the Hudson Valley. The center seeks to conduct research on regional topics and encourages faculty to build regionally based service activity into their scholarship and teaching, which is very important for all colleges and universities. It creates and directs institutes and programs to meet regional needs, among them educational programs that are so important to all of us. And it also offers conferences and programs on matters of regional interest. So in other words, I interpret the center as being a very important foundational piece of our community when it comes to the kinds of matters that we're talking about this morning. Dr. Benjamin joined the New Paltz faculty as an assistant professor of political science in 1968. And he achieved the university's highest rank in 2002 when he was appointed distinguished professor by the SUNY Board of Trustees. Congratulations on that distinction. He served as the chair of the Department of Political Science, presiding officer of the faculty, and for 12 years, beginning in 1996, he was the dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, which is, of course, very close to my heart. So I'm very pleased that you have that professional background. Associate Vice President Benjamin earned his Bachelor of Arts with distinction from St. Lawrence University, great liberal arts university. He gained his master's in 1967, and he achieved his doctoral degree in political science from Columbia University. So as I said at the beginning, Dr. Benjamin, I find, is very well prepared to lead this discussion this morning. He formerly served as the director for the Center for New York State and Local Government Studies at SUNY's Rockefeller Institute of Government. And between May of 1993 and March of 1995, he served as a research director for the Temporary State Commission on Constitutional Revision, which was appointed by then Governor Mario Cuomo. Before that, he was principal research advisor to New York City Charter Revision Commission, which we'll be touching on this morning, that achieved the most extensive structural changes in the government of that city in its history. Between 2004 and 2006, by unanimous bipartisan action of the county legislature, he was appointed to chair the Ulster County Charter Commission, which is a form of governance that we'll talk about this morning. The work of that commission resulted in approval at the polls of the county's first charter. In 2007, Associate Vice President Benjamin was appointed by Governor Spitzer to the State Commission on Local Government Efficiency and Competitiveness, that in 2008 proposed wide-reaching reforms in local government in New York State. If that's not enough to qualify him for this discussion, between 1981 and 1993, Dr. Benjamin was also an elected member of the Ulster County Legislature. He served in the legislative leadership position as majority leader and also chairman. Ulster County during this time had no elected executive. The legislative chairman was therefore the county's chief elected officer. County government in rural New York has responsibility, as you'll hear this morning, for the delivery of our most important local services. Ulster County, during Dr. Benjamin's tenure, had a budget of $165 million and more than 1,300 employees. You would think that would have kept him busy enough, but he's also written and edited 14 books or monographs and numerous government reports, articles, and opinion essays. His book with Richard Nathan on regionalism and realism in local governance in the New York City metropolitan region was published by the Brookings Institution Press and was named at that time the Outstanding Academic Title by Choice Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to tell you that Dr. Benjamin will come forward now to give his presentation. We've developed a couple of ground rules. I hope that you'll be comfortable with these. What we decided in our conversation before today's session is that Dr. Benjamin has a presentation that will go on about 45 minutes. He's happy to take a question, but as the moderator, we've agreed that in order to get through all this material, which is very important to your consideration, what we'll do is we'll take one question at a time about a topic, if somebody would like to ask a question, and then we'll move on, and we'll have ample time then at the end of the session for a more open Q&A. So if you're okay with that format, that way we can be sure to get through all of the material, which I've had a chance to preview, and I can tell you we're in for a treat. So, Dr. Gerald Benjamin.
Well, good morning. That was an extraordinary introduction, and I'm a little daunted by it. Some people have mentioned to me that it's a great coincidence that the Benjamin Center is headed by somebody named Benjamin. The story of that is that the president approached me about this idea, and I declined to support it because I said, you know, I'm Jewish and we have certain practices in my religion. One is that we only name things after people who are deceased, and I'm not willing to meet the condition. but he persisted and demonstrated that that was no longer the case by bringing forward some buildings that were named after people still very much alive. So here I am in this role. I'm delighted to be here. I'm appreciative of Jim Kevlin's initiative in bringing me here. Tara Barnwell has a fantastic place to stay and sleep. I recommend it for anybody who's having guests. In fact, I told my wife that we would come back and stay. Because we come to Cooperstown to watch Little League baseball from time to time. And Springbrook, of course, is spectacular. I stayed extraordinarily impressed as I drove up to the building. I haven't seen the whole place. So I'm going to proceed through a presentation today to inform your consideration of alternative structures of county government. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not situated to tell you what to do, nor do I wish to. And I want to emphasize that the options are available to communities, and communities choose those that are best suited to their needs. So I will be trying to fill in some of the blanks on the facts. I might be repeating some of the things you already know, but I think at the end of the day, my goal is to inform the community's decision-making and provide a substantive base for those decisions that are richer and fuller than may be the case before the presentation. First, back to civics, there are two. We are as Americans very familiar with the separation of powers model for government, and these slides will all be available. So if you have the desire to have them, we'll post them on Benjamin Center website, and we'll make them available to the newspaper website. So should be no concern about being able to retrieve the information. We're used to a separation of powers model. We study it. We have it in state government. We have it in national government. We have it in some of our local governments, although it's exceptional. But in fact, the normative structure for government in rural and local government in rural and even urban America is a parliamentary system. That is, the legislature is the locus of power, and the executive is derivative of the legislative. So if you think about your school districts, your towns, your villages to some degree, counties in the standard modality in New York, they are parliamentary systems, and it's hard for us to think about that because we think of parliamentary systems as foreign, and separation of power systems as American. But in fact, that's the model that we use for local government. When we're considering local government form, we have to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. What are the goals? What are the goals in taking up a form of government? And I saw that you have a plan that you just completed, so the goals may be, this community might have had a thorough discussion and decided upon its goals. I don't know if those goals are in dispute or not. I'm not fully informed about your community's deliberations. I have to ask, what is the tone and character of the civic discourse in your community? How does decision-making go forward? Is it relatively conflictual? Is it relatively consensual? What is the character of the community, economically and socially? What are the cleavages? Is partisanship important? Are there geographic cleavages? In Ulster County, we have a north-south cleavage, for example. Are there cultural differences in the community? Are there lifestyle differences? What are the values? Are the values shared, or are the values diverse? Because political systems function best when they're designed or structured toward purposes. And we don't think about that very much because we rarely change the fundamentals of our governance at the national or even at the state level. But we often can change the fundamentals of our governance at the local level. So we have a chance to align the structure with these kind of considerations. That's a little different than we might think about. We tend to accept what we find in place, but in local government we actually have choices. Now, the state constitution requires all local governments to have, and I quote, a legislative body elected by the people thereof. That's a constitutional right in New York, and I am tempted to go afield and discuss the function of state and national constitutions. I've done that across the state in the last year, and I'm not going to do it here, but I'll take questions. But a constitutional right to a legislative body elected by the people. But there is no requirement in the state constitution to have an elected executive. That's a choice if you wish to make it. So the initial choice for local governments is whether to be governed for counties, is whether to choose to be governed under state law in place for county governance, or to take the home rule option of adopting a charter and defining the structure of government uniquely for that community. Early county charters were adopted by special action of the state legislature. County charters are now adopted in accord with the Home Rule article of the New York Constitution, Article 9. And 23 counties have charters. The very first had their own special laws, Westchester and Nassau. Now we operate in accord with the constitutional definition of how to proceed if we want a charter, and we, of course, have implementing statutes. So we can operate under either state law or under charter. 34 counties. We figure in having this conversation that there are 62 counties in New York, 5 within New York City, and they have no substantial governance responsibility. So we're talking about 57 counties, 34 counties, AllOTSEGO among them, operate under state law. Now, state law offers options, as we will see. So we have, under state law, there are two options: boards of supervisors or boards of legislators. 18 counties are operating with boards of legislators. 16 counties are now operating with boards of supervisors. Now, this slide is incomplete because of the necessity to be a little bit, offer a little less detail. But essentially, in 1964, we had the one-person, one-vote decision in the U.S. Supreme Court, so we can no longer operate boards of supervisors without voting, because that would have made some places overrepresented, other places underrepresented. So we had to find some way to comply. Two ways we adopted, there are actually more than two ways, but the two fundamental ways that we adopted were to adopt weighted voting, or to create a board of legislators with that in some manner means equalize the population within a plus or minus 5% for each district. I understand there's weighted voting with the board of legislators in this county. It's a hybrid system, but the great value of maintaining the board of supervisors, you could adhere to community or town boundaries in the design of your government. There's some dispute over whether weighted voting is in fact constitutional practice, but it has been endorsed by federal courts, so it persists as an option. There's a question about the nature of representation under weighted voting, but that's a separate matter. Can answer questions. So how do we offer or design the executive function in counties operating under state law? So we're going to proceed in two categories: operating under state law and then operating under charter. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the two fundamental systems that I was asked to discuss: the elected executive and the appointed manager. The alternative county law offers 5 options for the executive function under state law. Legislative chair elected by his or her peers acting as administrator. Legislature appointing an administrator. The legislature appointing a director. Legislature appointing a manager. And the people electing a president. Now, the third and fifth options are not used. They're available but not used. The last one is interesting. Nassau County had an official called the president, so I'm sure the state, I haven't researched this, so I may be wrong. This actually happens from time to time. but I think that probably that term appears in law because Nassau County was using it at the time the law was passed. So county chair is administrator. The Board of Supervisors appoints the chairman of the Board of Supervisors as county administrator, who performs the duties of the county administrator concurrently with those of chairman, but without additional compensation. Chairman may serve as head of one or more departments not administered by an elected official, but without additional compensation. The chair as administrator appoints the purchasing agent. Again, that's an anomaly in law. And you'll find those of you who look at New York law, I recommend it for people who have difficulty sleeping. Those of you who look at New York law know that there are lots of special laws passed, or lots of provisions in law that are designed to accommodate one place in one particular circumstance, or a few places. So not every detail can be explained with some kind of systematic rationale. The administrator is executive. Now notice the distinction between the term administrator and the term manager, and that is not a category. The administrator tends to be less empowered than the manager, certainly in state law. And if you adopt a charter and create an administrator's position, the language tends to sometimes, and manager tends to be convergent. They tend to be treated as equivalent, but conceptually they're distinct. Manager holding a degree more of authority than an administrator. The Board of Supervisors appoints the administrator under state law. If that's not under state law, the administrator serves terminus with that board's term of office. The vacancies are filled by appointment of the board for the remainder of the term of office. So the administrator is an agent of the board. Very, very obviously intended to be an agent of the board because it serves only as long as that board's term persists. The manager system, the third possibility under the alternative county law, the Board of Supervisors appoints the manager. He serves during pleasure of the board, so the same idea. He he or she must reside in the county, not when appointed, but when they take up the job. The member of the board can become the manager, so we can't create a manager system to accommodate an individual. The manager appoints, supervises, at the pleasure, removes every other administrative officer or employee of the county except those elected by the voters and their subordinates. Very important. The power to appoint and remove is with the manager. It's distinct from an administrative system. The manager may serve without additional compensation as the head of one or more departments. This is sometimes done for reasons of economy or sometimes done for reasons of convenience. So it's not a no. County director has a fixed term. And as we'll discuss, one of the issues of having a manager system is whether you can hire somebody who will serve at the pleasure of, who will uproot themselves and move to another community and not have some kind of job security. So the fixed term, of course, gives certain security and, on the other hand, makes the appointed officials may make them less responsive to the board and has the same capacity to serve as head of another department. And the president is what we would call the county executive. The term is specified as 3 years when first elected, 4 years after first elected. Vacancies are filled by the appointment of the board until the next succeeding election. And so we see here, this is an elected executive system. Now, an interesting question, and we'll go forward, is why would we have a charter if we can have these options under state law? What would be different about having a charter? So I'm going to address that as we go forward. So for your information, under the state law, here's what an executive does. He or she serves as budget officer, reports to the board on the condition of the government. That's my summary language, because there are 2 locations in the law where it talks about reporting to the board. Recommends needed actions. So we call this the state of the county address. You may have such a speech, or state of the city or state of the village. Enforces the laws, assures financial probity. Again, my summary language. Make sure that the money that's appropriated is spent in accordance with the intention of the legislature, and that there's nobody stealing anything. Additional duties as assigned, attends board meetings at will or at request. When delegated, coordinates the management of county affairs, requires audits as needed, reports results, supervises the administration of all functions transferred. Transference of functions is an interesting subject that I'm not going to talk about in detail here, but it may require referendum in some circumstances. This is a terrible slide. If it were given to me by a student, I would give it a C-. But I was trying to summarize the differences. So the presiding officer is a part-time official serving as the administrator, has limited legal authority, but has legitimacy arising from election. Legitimacy arising from election is a very, very important point in charter-based situations. The appointed administrator has limited legal authority, serves for the legislative term, but it has professional credentials to be public administrator. The appointed manager has power to hire and fire, so it can exercise authority over the departments that the administrator may not be able to exercise, because the power to hire and fire resides with the body, not with the individual. Serves at the board's pleasure as a professional manager. The director is appointed for a fixed term. As I pointed out, the elected executive has a 4-year term with no term limitation and veto power, which empowers him or her significantly relative to the legislature, because it required the legislature to produce an extraordinary majority to act. I once, as an aside, because I find that attention spans are not always 45 minutes, I was once talking to Governor Cuomo about this when we had the charter, when we had the Constitutional Commission process going on. And I said, well, he said, the legislature is more powerful than the governor. And I said, he was a law professor.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that. So very much like to tell professors things they didn't know. And then he said, you used to call yourself a professor. So in general, formal powers of each form are specified in state law. The points of difference for the executive are the security in office, the appointing power, and the independence from the legislative branch by length of term. State law may be augmented by local law, so you could set out qualifications for appointing a manager or administrator in state law. And the question of informal power has to be ended at some point. An appointed person can get powerful by living a long time in the community, coming to events like this, making decisions people think are smart. I was reading the local paper, Jim. You provided me for me without charge in my room. And I noticed that Mayor Katz announced that he's not running for re-election. Mayor Katz here. The paper in reviewing his record talked about imposing parking fees as a revenue source. And that being controversial at the outset, it turned out to be a smart idea to produce lots of. From a politician, it kind of instinctively is a good idea because it gets somebody else to pay for your stuff. It exports the cost of government, which politicians tend to like. When I was a politician, I liked it. We had a bed fee in our hotels, so I helped them for that. Still controversial. And the point is that a person who makes, he's an elected official, but a person who's appointed and makes a tough decision like that, and the decision bears out, they become rooted in the community's mind as a person who's smart and able. So you can get empowered even though you're not formally empowered by the informal accretion of power and influence, and you can do that as an elected official too. So when we talk about formal powers, we have to understand that there's an informal dimension. And there's two dimensions that we can't control. We can't control the quality and character of every person we elect, and we can't control the informal relationships that build over time based on human networks, achievements, perceptions of the community, and so on. They have to converge, and for the government to work, they have to converge in a happy synergy. Counties with boards of supervisors or legislators, here's how the executive function sorts out. BOS means Board of Supervisors. That's not a BS. Just notice that. There's no use of the appointed director or the elected president. The appointed manager is found in 2 places, the administrator in 7 places, the presiding officer is chair in 7 places. And you can see the legislatures tend to be more likely to have appointed administrators or appointed managers in a proportional type. So that's how what's been chosen by New York counties today. So this is what the county manager system looks like from, that's the board, the red is the board, the green is the manager, the yellow is the department heads. Notice the board has no direct interaction with the department heads. Now that's not exactly so because the board passes the budget and the board can go to the department head and likely give advice on the appointments. But certainly since the manager is responsible for that, can summon the department heads to committee meetings to be accountable for their behavior. But in terms of day-to-day management, the idea is to separate out the department heads from the policy-making board. The model is a corporate model. It goes back to the progressive period and the development of the private corporation in American history in the late 19th century. And there's a CEO. Sometimes we find, we've had lots of controversy about the nature of corporate boards in America. Sometimes we find the CEO on the board, but this is the formal model. Council is the board of directors, makes policy, oversees performance, responsible to the stakeholders, to stockholders, voters. The manager or CEO appoints the department heads, prepares the budget, directs day-to-day operations, recommends policies, accountable to the board, but is not a board member. That's a typo. The president told me I had typos. I went very thoroughly through the presentation, and I still have typos. see that might be familiar to people who understand, who pay attention how corporations are organized. And again, the formal and informal, the informal is not given consideration here. This is the formal arrangement. The executive function in counties with operating with charters. This is my second major category. Is everybody still with me here? If you're not with me, raise your hand. No. When I was in the Army, there was a way of getting people to volunteer. It was sort of like that. Here are the charter counties. You can see where you are. You can see that the charter counties are universal and downstate. Actually, New York City is a reformed structure. It's an integrated multi-county municipality. People in New York City don't realize how well upstate New York is governed. That's one of our problems in upstate New York. We get people running the state who don't understand that we have a layered and complicated local government system, because they have, even though we think of the city as very complex, structurally it's very simple. There's one overarching municipal government. It doesn't have separate school boards, it doesn't have separate towns, it doesn't have separate villages. It has public authorities. So downstate we have the charter system having been universally adopted up through Ulster. And then you can see in the more populous counties, at the beginning of the less populous counties, the charter system starting to be adopted. This development has occurred over the period 1935 till now, so it's almost 3/4 of a century. It's not that fast. But the tendency has been for charters to be adopted going northward and west in the state in recent times. Charter counties tend to be more suburban, more populous, more demographically diverse. Obviously, they have bigger budgets and more diverse functions. And they have a large concentration in the southeast state. So why do people want a charter? Essentially, it's a question of local choice. And you can have, if you operate under state law, you're confined to the powers and duties as distributed, as defined in the state law. But you can organize, in the charter system, you can organize the powers and duties as you prefer. So you can mix and match, you can create hybrid systems as was suggested. So you can have local design of the system, you can have term limitation, you can have independent redistricting, you can have campaign finance limits, you can have a budget process that's a little different in its timing and reach. You can change the mix of elected officers and functions. Not fully, but to some degree. You may decide you don't want a treasurer, you want a controller. You may decide that the policing function should be done differently in the county than having it done by the sheriff's road patrol. You could address the intergovernmental dynamics. When I was working on the Ulster County Charter, we created an intergovernmental consultation process in the charter so that by the county executive to convene that. I would say less than fully successful because it hasn't been used as conceived. Currently, the governor's drive to get counties to cooperate more with other local governments to save money has brought that part of our charter back into focus because we actually have that provision in our charter. And a charter creates a hybrid. So you can get more local design through a charter. Now, I want to remember, I'm not advocating a charter. I'm describing what could happen. It tends to sound like advocacy, and you have to put the question mark in your head that this guy is not aware of his biases. It's important because you might choose to operate under state law and try to manage your system under state law, and you might then try to consider a charter with a manager and a later element. You might want to proceed incrementally rather than proceed directly to the charter process. Charter process and charter township. Counties with charters tend to have elected executives, so people tend to conflate charters with elected executives. But you don't have to have an elected executive if you have a charter. You can have a manager, you can have an administrator. You can have what the charter says you have. not my fault. Now, I like, by the way, what I like about this is we got the voters into the chart. So the voters elect the legislature, elect the executive, and the executive appoints the department heads, with the exception of those departments that are headed by elected officials, either constitutionally specified or statutorily specified elected officials. So you can see that under the previous chart, the executive is accountable to the legislature. Under this chart, the executive is independent of the legislature in response to the people. Now, the question came up in Ulster County recently. I'm on a committee in the county about independent redistricting. And the legislative chair, who was a student of mine, curiously, said that redistricting should be subject to the will of the people, and therefore the legislature should have to approve it. And that's not so. And the reason it's not so is that the will of the people is manifested in the charter. The charter is the will of the people. The legislature is created in the charter, just like the New York State legislature is created in the New York State Constitution. It's not, the institutions are subordinate to the people's will. And the charter is a manifestation of the people's will. That's why we put the charter to a vote. That's why we put the constitutional changes to a vote. Because the people are in charge. Now, you should be, if you're in the room, if Jim got you to come, then he attracted you by a talk on this subject. When you've been doing a lot of other things, you're probably pretty interested and committed to representative democracy. And if you're committed to representative democracy, you understand that the ultimate authority of a democratic society is the people. So if the people say that you can have legislative districts without legislative participation, the legislature has to accept it because that's the will of the people. Here we have the will of the people acting to create separate institutions. And the authority of the executive flows from the people's will, not from the legislature's will. And that's a big difference. That changes the government a lot, as we'll see. I went the wrong way. Now I'm not going right at all. We've got a technical issue. Okay. The elected executive system is modeled on the national and state government, except that the legislature is not bicameral. We actually had bicameral legislatures in cities in New York, but I won't give you that irrelevant information. We have none left. A full separation of powers. Voters elect the executive, invest him or her with executive powers. Voters elect a board, invest it with legislative powers. But executive has no vote in the legislature. This is called a strong, in cities, it's called a strong mayor system. That's the end. Something's wrong. I need technical assistance here. Now, do we have an arrow that we can make happen here somehow? Okay, let's see if we can click on this. What does that say? Okay, so Montgomery County, if you come back to this presentation and click on that, you'll see the Montgomery County Charter. And the reason I wanted to show you that very quickly is I wanted you to be able to compare the powers of the executive under a charter, the powers of the executive as specified in the state law. And you can see they're different. So it's not a mortal failure that we can't see it. It doesn't kill the presentation, but you'll see that the design in the charter of the executive is different than the design in the state law. So that was elected executive strengths and weaknesses. The executive is rooted and highly visible in the community as a person in charge. This is really, really important. When outside people come to the community and say, who do I talk, who's in charge? I want to build a factory. I want to locate a business, or I want to start a school. They're expecting somebody to be in charge. Now they often would meet with me when I was head of the legislature in Ulster County under the assumption that I was in charge. And I like to think that I had significant influence in Ulster County, but I was not in charge. The legislature was in charge. And anything that I wanted to do, I wanted to make sure I got. In those days, we had 33 members, which was a lot of them. I had 17 votes to do it. Very little I could do by myself. So there's an expectation that somebody's in charge. Also, when I was chairman of the legislature, the people of the county thought I was in charge. So it's very bad to have expectations of people being able to do things they can't do, because it creates not only disappointment, but disillusionment with government. He's in charge, she's in charge. Why aren't they doing X? Why aren't they doing that? Enters with the support of political coalition. The manager is hired by the board, and the board is invested in that, at least the majority of the board is invested in that choice. A former student of mine was recently hired in Yates County after an interesting deliberative process when they determined whether they wanted to continue with an executive at all. And I had the opportunity to talk to them about it. I didn't recommend the individual. It was a kind of genuine coincidence that he was later hired. But they took a long time to choose him, and they wanted him to succeed. So he had that support. But he didn't have the support of the broad community who had voted for him, and he didn't present a program to the broad community. He said, if I'm elected, I'm going to do this. And the community could come back in 2 years or 4 years and say, yes, you did it, or no, you didn't. So that coalition building is important for efficacy going forward and legitimacy going forward. The program is advanced and tested in the electoral process. Do people want this? What do the opponents say? What do you say? What was promised? The person is known and networked in the state and local systems. Very important dimension of having an executive is the executive is in the partisan network of New York. So the governor knows who the county executives are, because when he goes to the Democratic dinner in AllOTSEGO County or in Erie County or Monroe County, he sees the executive. The executive is in that network. And the executive is kind of regarded as not a peer of the governor, especially this governor. Forgive me, but it occasionally slips out. I'm a disciplined person, but not that disciplined. So anyway, you can see the analog. So when a group of executives call upon the governor, they have kind of a simpatico environment. And managers and administrators don't have that same stature. They're not in, they know the partisans, but in fact they have a certain stake in not being partisan, because that's not why they were hired. So that partisan network is important. Informal interactions rise out of it, and support networks and so on. In my experience, elected executives can discipline the management of the county to a greater degree than appointed officials, because appointed officials, a back door is open to chairs of legislative committees by the relationship between department heads and those committee heads. That is sometimes results in good things happening. It's not always a bad thing, but it keeps the government from operating as a kind of a hierarchical organization. And it sometimes can confuse the management of the county government and dissipate its actions. It also can drive inefficiencies. I remember that I always thought our highway department in the county was overstaffed because there were certain considerations other than the need for additional people that went into hiring people in the highway department. Some were very almost charitable in their character. When we had a county executive, he just diminished the size of the highway department because he operated entirely on concern for the budget and concern for efficiency. And he didn't have to choose that, but he chose that he was able to do it. We couldn't do it without it. of course, having an elected executive is good for the community's political system because it has some weaknesses, maybe untrained and untested in administration of a large organization. So that my colleagues in the Charter Commission of Ulster County call this the popular incompetent. And it's a risk. So when you make these decisions, you're talking about balancing risk against benefit. You're not talking about an unalloyed good thing and an unalloyed bad thing. Hedges with parts and adversaries. I know that students of mine who become managers automatically have a part of the board with an elected executive. The legislators in place all complain that they've been disempowered. And we have to give consideration to that, the truthfulness of that. I have argued with elected legislators that they don't know how to be legislators, and that's why they're disempowered. This is not a comfortable conversation. But in fact, they're used to one system, they get into another system with an elected executive, and they don't know how to function. Short-term thinking. Politicians think to the next election. I don't mean to be offensive to anybody in the room, but this is, I think, a fair assessment. And in general, America tends to think short-term. Corporations report quarterly or every half year. Stock market moves on those reports. So short-term thinking. Preoccupation with re-election considerations as well as so-called blue government considerations. Entrenchment. I'll give you a slide on that. But elected executives tend to stay a long time. It's very hard to beat an incumbent in an election. And it's particularly hard to beat an incumbent in an election where he or she's the only touchstone that unites everybody. That's the only person they all know about. And personal political interest may rise above public interest. That's complicated because the nature of the public interest is debatable. It's not many times. So here's I calculated this for this presentation. Am I going on too long, Jim? We're okay? Okay. There are 5 elected executives in New York who have served 3 or more terms, 9 who are in their second term or just starting their second term, and only 4 that have served 1 term or fewer. Once you get into the job, and we've had some very high-profile incumbents defeated in the current election. Most interestingly, Rob Astorino, who was an aspirant for the governorship head of Westchester County government, who succeeded twice in a county that's now heavily Democrat. So we do get incumbents defeated, but actually it's frustrating for many communities that the executive becomes unassailable politically. And so the idea that you're going to have an accountable and responsive government because of competitive elections is aspirational. It's not descriptive in some communities. Appoint executive strengths and weaknesses. Hired with specified credentials, and those can be set out in law. I worked with Beacon, Newburgh, Poughkeepsie about defining the credentials of the city manager in the charter. Avoids concentrating political power because political power stays with the legislature. Professionally trained and likely some experience in managing large public entities. In other words, in a county this size, you probably get a manager who's not just starting out. If you hire one, you probably get someone in early mid-career. Longer-term thinking encouraged. Network regionally and nationally aware of best practices. Now, elected officials can be aware of best practices too, but they're less likely to be. They're more likely to be parochial. Now, parochial is not necessarily bad, but it's not the same. Best in more consensual, lower conflict environments. If there's a convergence on values and purposes of the government, then you need somebody to work toward it. If there's a desire to need to create that consensus or to act in accord with majoritarian views in a non-consensual, non-conflict environment, elected executives can be better at that. Can build an informal community base, as I talked about informal social power. Disadvantages, no political base. in the broader community, less visibly in charge. People have a hard time understanding what a manager. When a city has a manager, people also still expect the mayor to be in charge, because the person's title is mayor. And they think the manager is an assistant to the mayor. So there's confusion about that. Now, this is not the fault of the structure, it's the fault of the understanding of the education of the community about this structure. But it's so, and it's mischievous. Security is dependent on maintaining the support of the legislative coalition, not local, so not rooted in the local community. Can become local, of course. I've been living in New Paltz 50 years, and somebody told me the other day that I was local. 49 years wasn't enough. Some of you might think this is a joke, and it is a joke, but think about your own attitude about when a person who comes to Cooperstown becomes local. Certainly not the first day. Certainly not the second day. You know, but at some time the transition occurs. We have people in my community who have never been to New York City. We live an hour and a half from New York City, and the bus on my corner goes there without stopping. So, you know, there are very different attitudes about what it means to be local, and I'm sure that's true to some measure. So the person who is appointed is maybe looking for promotion, and their path for promotion is not in the political path, but is more likely going to a bigger place that pays more. So you have an advantage in them wanting to make a career by doing well where they are, but you have a disadvantage in them looking outside to make their career grow. They're more likely to be bypassed in the manner I suggested by political channels going around their authority or undermining their authority. What is the effect for the legislature? There are a lot of, I noticed there are a lot of legislators here, so this is a pretty germane point. A lot of people make fun of me for using the word germane. My staff always goes around saying germane. It's one of my vocabulary idiosyncrasies. Appointed executive. The issues for the legislature. Will the legislature actually accept the policy administration dichotomy? This is a false dichotomy because we all know that there's politics in administration, but to the degree that we want it to be present, will the legislature accept it if they have an appointed executive? This can be addressed in some degree by the nature of how powered the appointee is, as we pointed out. But bypassing the executive through the legislative chairs, through the legislative leadership, in day-to-day management becomes an issue. Credit taking by elected officials. This is not obvious, but unfortunately a lot of elected officials, because their careers or the continuation in office is dependent on being able to claim achievements with regard to their promises, sometimes take credit for the work of officials who are appointed in government. And this is corrosive behavior. It makes the people who are appointed resentful, even though they never say it. They say, we understand politics requires it. And that happens in administrative or managerial systems to a greater degree than the people who are in those systems would admit. So, the appointed executive, as I said, has to have leadership support. The partisan environment has to be supportive of success. The legislature has to have a decision-making style that understands, accepts, and supports the role of the appointed official. And the formal powers of the appointed official has to be sufficient so they can perform in accord with the acceptance of the legislature and the community. The elected executive for the legislature. The executive tends to co-opt portions of the legislature. So if the legislature has an institutional role, for example, they adopt the budget and they can do oversight on the performance of the budget. This is one of my favorite examples. What that means in the state legislature or in Congress is you call a head of a department before you and you ask about performance. You set goals in the budget and then you see if there's progress toward goals. But if the legislature is not cohesive and say the executive is a Republican and the legislative significant Republican membership, then the executive gets support on a partisan basis from that portion of the legislature, and the legislature can't press the executive by oversight because they can't cohere, or the leadership can't command these, and that's very important, especially at the point of transition. It's been a terribly difficult problem in Ulster County. Starting to sort out as the membership has kind of changed over time. Part-time legislators and full-time executives. So your elected executive is going to be a full-time official, and your legislators are going to remain part-time, and that's going to be way the process toward the elected executive. Loss of control, access to staffers, minimal staff support. So if you create a neglected executive system, you need to make sure that the legislature has a degree of competent staff that responds to it. So, for example, a legislature and a legislative system commands the responsiveness of the county attorney. You change to an executive system, the county attorney responds to the executive. Sometimes the legislature wants the county attorney to do something for it. The county attorney can't have two clients. If the legislature is at odds with the executive, the county attorney has to choose. So the legislature needs legal advice. Now, sometimes legislatures will create an appropriation on that contingency. They won't hire staff. Sometimes they'll hire staff. You also need policy staff and budget staff. I'm not talking about a lot of people, but people with those competencies. So when you create such a system, people saying you're creating, quote, another layer of government. It's not another layer of government. It's assuring that the legislature is competent, the part-time legislature is competent to take on an executive that controls the resources of the government to a great degree. Now, in a collaborative environment, this is less of a problem. So if you go to Dutchess County, you're going to find it's less of a problem than in a less collaborative environment than like in Ulster. Difficulty in operating, creating institutional loyalty. I talked about that. Poorly understood legislative role. This is one of my learning points. I thought that I could be better at teaching people in my own community how a legislature can maximize its effectiveness than I have been. And unfamiliarity with optimizing legislative powers. These are three ways, a way of saying the same thing. Now, I'll give you one example. I was in a team that, 2 minutes. College presidents on my right. College presidents, my inclination is to fall to my knees and pray. But final points. Okay?
Sure.
Okay.
We just need to make sure that we've got plenty of time
Right.
to get to questions.
I was on a team that reviewed, there's a recent statutory requirement for counties to collaborate with other local governments in their jurisdiction to create economies. And I was in the team that was contracted to review this outcome of this process. And what I wanted you to see here was that counties could defer this for a year, and the places with executives, especially elected executives, were less likely to defer. And I think there are two reasons for this. One is a political hostility to the command, which is universal in New York State, called the mandate. And the second is capacity. And the capacity to direct the government's attention towards a new requirement. And there are potential rewards to participating in this. Other considerations, you have other countywide executive offices, you adopt a charter, there are some of those that you can't touch and some of those that you can touch. And hybrid systems, which was already mentioned. But if you create a hybrid system, this is a chart we made for Poughkeepsie, New York, but if you commit a hybrid system, create one, you better be sure that you have the authority of the people in it clear, because it tends to create confusion and conflict in the government, so you have to be very clear. In Poughkeepsie, they couldn't decide between a strong mayor and a manager. They created a hybrid, and they created nobody knew who was in charge, so they had to change back. If you want to contact me, it's here. I answer my mail. I know we're in.
So let's give it a
I'm so impressed with all the information you provided us. I know from talking with you before this presentation, Jerry, that one of your goals was to increase our understanding and also to challenge us to think about how in this area we might best go forward in terms of governance. So before we take questions, which Jerry's willing to do, and I'll do my best to moderate them, I want to, because you might otherwise forget to do it, I want to thank Jim Kevlin for assuring that this forum took place this morning. I've been consistently impressed with how important advancing and moving this region is to you, Jim, and so thank you very much for making this happen. I appreciate it. Great, so let's go ahead and have questions. Yes, sir.
My understanding is that I think the Sullivan County has been going through this process recently of trying to decide whether to have a manager or whether to have an executive, and I think we've been involved in that. I guess I'm just wondering if it's not a totally dissimilar county to this county. I'm wondering if you have any comments on a real life example where people.
Right, well, Sullivan Camp, you sent me a transcript of what I said that's inaccurate. First of all, which is not deeply inaccurate, but inaccurate in detail, because the transcriber didn't know some of the words I was saying, or some of the points I was making. So, for the record, they have a manager system under a charter. They've been dissatisfied with the manager system. I think they have a high concentration of poverty in Sullivan County, and have been very economically challenged. They're hoping that the opening of a casino, which would go long because of the decline of the Catskill hotel industry, and opening a casino would help them. So I think they're less well situated economically in this county. But they've been thinking that an elected executive would give force and direction to their government. And they've been dissatisfied with, they've attributed to the manager the failure of direction. And I'm not sure that's fully accurate. But I think that and I didn't have a substantial role. I gave I gave testimony in one public hearing at their request. So I think that their dissatisfaction with the manager is driving their interest in elected executive. They might get what they want from an elected executive, but I think their analysis of their situation is not fully accurate. There are extrinsic variables that are
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for all you said. I didn't hear anything about the employees, and I was a little astounded when you said the executive came in. He was able to cut the employment in one department, highway department, commission. What happens to the unions and working with the
Well,
employees? Is there a difference between the executive and the manager regarding this?
I want to make sure everybody heard that question. So the question is there a difference between the executive and the manager when it comes to employee relations and making employment decisions? And then you raise the issue of unions and how unions are dealt with.
It's a very good question. In fact, I can't say all counties have a unionized workforce. I think that's true, but I haven't looked. And most public employees, other than those in managerial roles, are covered by the labor contract. The labor contract doesn't prevent reductions in force for budgetary reasons. It directs the process for reduction in force. So the question is, if you are faced with budgetary stringencies, would reducing the force be an option that you consider? Most places use that as only a last resort, and maybe for good reason. But some places don't consider it because those people are also voters. They also have resources that they bring to bear in elections and so on, the labor unions. So I think that a manager confronted with a budget problem has to gather the majority in the legislature to take actions that would require reducing the workforce. And I think that's a lot harder to do than for an executive to decide that, especially if the executive has a 4-year term and is distant from his or her next election.
Yes.
Again, thank you for your talk. Thank you very much. At the very beginning, you said vision as I interpreted that. And then just now you're talking about Sullivan County where there was some confusion about what the goals and purposes were, who was responsible for that. Can you say a few words of where does that come from? Where do those goals and purposes come from in the county?
Well,
And who's responsible for them?
Well, it depends. It depends is always the best answer. After all, I've been a professor for half a century. One way of getting goals and purposes in place is to have a political campaign where the goals and purposes of the community are the focus of the campaign. That's not always the way politics works, but that's one way. So we have a very famous example in Suffolk County where John Klein, who's a legendary county executive, one of the early county executives, the first in Suffolk County, and one of the very early ones in New York State, committed himself to open space. You know, Suffolk County has been suburbanizing. It's the most eastern county in New York, Long Island. And they had lots of duck farms and potato farms and wineries and things like that, and they were being developed. And Klein ran and said, if I get elected, we're going to borrow, he said a number, it's tens of millions of dollars, and we're going to buy development rights as a county initiative. That was a goal that the legislature couldn't agree on. And he made it a live or die goal. He was elected and he implemented that goal. So that wasn't a whole plan like your plan, but it was a sort of a very specific electoral purpose. Another way to do it is to agree that you're going to have a planning process that's consensual, participatory, lots of public hearings, outreach, and develop plans and purposes that the government has pointed to, and then the elected officials agree or commit to effecting that plan. But I think that it's a fair point, and I'm not going to be fully informed here, but from casual observation, less than more than casual observation, but not full information, I think that Sullivan County has a long time looked for economic saviors and not had an economic plan. And they've also thought about alternative government structures as an alternative to having a plan, not as a way of implementing a plan. So that would be my view. And that's without prejudice to individuals who are very committed to the well-being of that county and have worked hard toward that.
So with
They're very resource constrained too. It's a big problem. And so one other point, for example, the jail issue there imposes an expense on them that it preempts other actions. So that's an extrinsic problem with having a plan or goals. Things come up.
So just as a clarification, is this identification of values and mission and goals, in your opinion, given your experience, is it an essential first step to making the kinds of decisions that we've talked about this morning? Does a community need to have defined those well before they can really go
It seems to
forward?
me that the community is paying attention to that. I didn't study your plan, but I looked on your website and I saw your plan. So the community's been paying attention to that here. So then the question comes, now we have the question of government structure. We have the plan, we've agreed on goals. It looked a little general to me, but it also looked considerate of the demographics of the economy and the right variables, the right factors. So now you're saying what government structure is going to get us to the plan? Now the people in the legislature right now might say, we're well situated to get us to the plan. We're okay with our government structure. Or they might say, well, let's try a different government structure. Here, now we know what the options are.
Sure.
But I think if that process was, as it's described, had been, you're ready for the next step.
Got it, okay. So we've got a lot of questions now. The gentleman here in the red shirt. Yes, sir.
So thank you for all the information you covered today, Dr. Benjamin. I was
Can
wondering,
you say your name, please?
my name is Daniel Lappin, incoming representative of the city of Oneonta. I was curious to see if you could direct us to any additional resources that we may use to advance our understanding of this topic.
I'm tempted to a joke. I wrote 14 books just so
It's the Benjamin Center for a reason. Yeah.
Sorry, forgive me for that. I just had the light brings up a little. I would look at the NISAC website, the NISAC description of county government. I would say that the programs put on by the state association, if taken seriously, are very valuable and informative. Governments sometimes cut their travel budget when they're in extremes and keep their legislators from going to these meetings. That's a bad idea, even though they might play golf when they go part of the time. There's a book called The Local Government Handbook. You can look at that. You can look at the website of the Secretary of State of New York. There are specific studies that they've done. In particular, you can look at the various studies that have, or various reports that have arisen from the incentive that the governor set up, Governor Andrew Cuomo set up for local government to be more efficient. A great number of studies on collaboration among governments and way to do things better. The national literature on county government is limited, and the structure and function of county government in different places differs to a degree. So I would be more advising more to look at the resources in New York. Another interesting place to look is the controller's financial reporting on county government. But I would caution you that the categories aren't always interpreted the same by county, so the reporting within those categories by different counties is not always comparable. I would take a close look before I make conclusions from those comparisons.
Great. Yes.
Richard Sternberg, trustee for Cooperstown. Under the current system, without a charter, I presume that the police function is vested in the sheriff's department, which is an elected official. Is that correct?
Well, the sheriff has a responsibility for the jail and for certain civil actions. The road control is discretionary.
The question I have is under a charter system, does the policing power and the jail power come under, can it come under the county government under a charter
The
system?
jail cannot. The policing power can be shifted and has been shifted in some counties. But interestingly, the idea to create a countywide, this is a third rail. Creating a countywide police department is a third rail. A lot of communities resist it. They want to have responsive police departments in their villages and towns if they have them. The coordination of policing among state police, local police, and the county is a consistent challenge across the state. But you can best policing in an official responsive to the executive. It's been done in Westchester and Madison.
Yes.
I'm Andrew Murray. I'm on the county legislature for representative Cooperstown. And can you speak to the emphasis that people put? We're having our own discussions, and that the county's had these discussions for many, many years about the county executive manager. But can you speak to the emphasis about this position bringing cost savings or securing revenue? It seems like there's so much weight put on that. Like that's the only reason,
Right.
and there's more negative that this position doesn't perform. I mean, can you speak to that?
Well, that's a great question, and noticing what isn't there is a sign of being well informed. Lots of people can see what's there, but not a lot of people can see what isn't there. When I advocated for Ulster County having a charter, I was able to show that it would be no more costly to have an elected executive than to proceed on in accord with the status quo. This was in 2000, 2001, roughly in that period. I was not able to show that it would be less expensive. I compared to a cohort of counties in the Hudson Valley and counties of similar size across New York. The experience of, since we only have had one executive, the experience under our executive is that he is constrained. He responded enormously effectively to the fiscal crisis of 2008. He has constrained tax increases beyond the expectation that I had. He has reduced the size of county government purpose. He's a Democrat, by the way, so this sounds like all kinds of Republican stuff. He's a Democrat, but he's a Democrat. And he has reduced the size of county government by offloading functions and reducing department sizes without, I think, diminishing service quality or quantity. I can't talk to whether he has been more successful at getting state resources into Ulster County on a comparative basis. He's gotten some. I don't know on a comparative basis whether he's done better than people with other government forms. For example, we had a county nursing home, and it was turned over to a private not-for-profit. And he managed that political process with great acuity and ability. And that reduced the size of county government without reducing the services, because they're still provided not by government. So I think, at least in that single example, we have had a government that's been fiscally more disciplined than it was when I was there.
I'm a member of one of the local League of Women Voter leagues, which first called for the sort of change in county government 30 years ago. I'm most interested in your sharing your thoughts on practices for how a county makes the change when it decides to so substantively change its structure and form of government. How does it do that with all the key stakeholders?
Well, that's specified in state law. The county was...
But I'm talking about the process.
The process is to create a charter commission.
I'm not...
I don't understand
The informal process of working with department heads, with staff, etc., to make it an effective shift and try to avoid some of the potential hazards.
Well, that's...
of crosswalk.
First you have to make the formal change, and you have to be inclusive in making the formal change. Then you would have a transition period. That's actually a very important point, because the transition period is not specified in law. And during the transition period, you would have to do a couple of things. First of all, write an administrative code that affects the charter change. The code and bring the laws of the local laws of the county into conformance with the charter, because now you have a new charter. At the same time, you have to be broadly consultative, as you are when the commission operates. It has public hearings. It calls people in. It doesn't wait for them to come in, but it will call the head of the union in. It will call department heads in. You give consideration to whether the departments would have presence in the charter. We decided to specify departments in the charter, even though from my point of view it was not good government, because it took away certain responsibility. But it gave comfort that when we transitioned, those departments would still exist. We heard public hearings. The county planning board was worried about the appointment of the county planner being in the hands of the county executive. They wanted to assure that their role in appointing the county planner was preserved. And we recognized that concern in the draft charter. So you really are anticipating these concerns, and then in the transition period, you're consulting further as you go to implement the charter in the first election, which you've targeted in the charter change process. So I think it's a good question, but I think there's a continuity of consultation and by the way, the vote to adopt a charter is tough. You need separate majorities, and the cities counted together and the rest of the county. So how many cities do you have here? One city. So that city has to give majority to the charter, and the rest of the county aggregate has to give a separate majority to the charter. So you have to work at intergovernmental relations too to get a charter adopted. I'm sorry I've not been fully responsive.
We've got 3 additional questions. We'll take you and then Dave and then Meg. But before we go on, is there a resource? I think Steve's question is really a deep question. It has a lot to do with the process once decisions are made. Is there a resource available to folks, or is it really the case that you need, if you want to do this smoothly, oftentimes you really need someone to come in from the outside to help guide the process?
Well, you might have somebody around. The thing that doesn't work is, I'm invested in this because we do the work, and also because I think expertise is important on this kind of decision. A lot of communities say, well, we'll change. It's obvious what change to make. We'll just change. We don't need any help. And I think that what happens, I've been called in a lot of times where the process is halfway through, like Westchester County, halfway through, and people say, we can't seem to get to an outcome because they haven't structured the process. They haven't thought through quite how to get to where they want to go or where they like to consider going. So you need to have advice, I think, professional advice to get this done. And people are charity that because it costs money and they think they can do it by themselves. But whether it's from inside the community with somebody who knows a lot about this or from outside. And there are many, I'm not the only place that provides this advice, there are a number of other places.
But that's the model that you feel, that you've seen has helped communities move forward without.
Yeah, and I think that, there are documents that the Secretary of State's office has published that are advisory and I think helpful, but I don't think that's sufficient.
Okay, great. Please.
Sandra Bliss, resident. Several times you talk about the changing role of the legislators. Would you go into that more deeply and what the confusion is?
Well, generally speaking, in a legislative system, there's a chairman of the legislature or chairperson. I know the person is a woman in this county, and a committee or one or two committees of great consequence. Usually, the finance committee is very important. And there's a series of committees, and the committees have departments reporting to them. And the legislators who are heads of those committees come to believe they're in charge of that. So they're in charge of mental health, and they're in charge of social services, and they're in charge of highways, because they're chair of the committee. And the chairman of the legislature actually, or by implication, accepts that. If I need to know about highways, I call Joan, who's chair of the highway committee. And if I need to know about mental health, I call John, who's head of mental health, in the legislature. When you have an executive system, the committees are no longer in charge of departments, and the executive will try to cut off the committee's access to department heads. Because the executive is a disciplined bureaucracy that responds to his or her priorities. So the executive will want the committee of the legislature, the chairman of the legislature, to talk to the deputy to the executive, or to talk to the executive. The executive will then get the answer from the transportation department. But in fact, the legislature is giving advice and consent to the appointment and appropriating the money for that department, so it can command the presence of the department head. If it wants that person to come to a meeting, they don't have to accept that the executive says, I don't want my commissioner to come to the meeting, because that's not okay. You're paying the bill. So my advice to legislators, that's a concrete example, my advice to them is pick the fight you want to have, but have it so that you can assert your authority and do your job. But they don't want to do that. They're divided apart from a partisan point of view, and they resist it. So you go from a system where the departments are very responsive to the legislature to a system where there's a resistance to responsiveness, but they still think they want the responsiveness. They've had life experience, and that's the way it works. So they're unhappy, but they don't know how to make the government work in the new paradigm. So what happens is they're ineffective, and they complain about the change because they have to learn new behaviors and new paths. I hope that's clear. And my observation on this is not theoretical, because I've been blamed for the devitalization of the legislature, at least initially after the charter was adopted. And although I think that I certainly have responsibility for the design of the charter, I think the people in the legislature have responsibility for knowing how to do their job too.
Dave.
My name's Dave Gerald. I'm a retired school superintendent. And before you answer my question, you should know that my graduate work in ed admin was at SUNY New Paltz, so keep that in mind.
And State University is contributing to the leadership of New York.
Yeah.
And we're doing a survey, forgive me for this, but we're doing a survey of elected leaders across New York State. We just did a random sample of all the elected leaders in New York State. So far in our responses, we've gotten 113 responses, 30% went to SUNY.
Great. Also, my undergraduate was at Harvard, so I should be.
I've got a few things to say about that.
An extraordinarily good college.
Yes.
It seems to me that this discussion about the form of government for counties, we are surrounded by very complex organizations that are subject to many of the same regulations that counties are. School districts that have an appointed executive, and it's a tradition in this state that's been going on forever. I would suggest that if you talk to anyone on the school board of a large school district, they could not imagine operating that district without an appointed executive of some form because of the complexities.
Well, that's actually the slides that came out. because I didn't have enough time, but if I had slides about towns, school districts, cities, and so on, that's a whole course, you think. But that's a perfect analogy. But what's interesting about that, historically, is that we separated the largest and most important local government function from all other functions in the early 20th century in New York, as many states have done, because to depoliticize the function. Now, as an experienced school executive, you know there are things, the politics go on in school boards. But the depolitization meant no Republicans, no Democrats. It was not a partisan kind of politics. Now, there is creative tension in the relationship between school boards and school administrators, and sometimes there are gray areas in who does what. That is a good analog of how a professional managerial system works, with one exception, that we purposely separated it and denied the elected executive option to the schools. It might not have been a good idea to have that, but we don't have it. So we don't have any experience. We have experience with schools being run as part of local government generally before the 20th century, but that's too remote to be useful and probably is not a good idea.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take Meg and then we'll go to the back.
Meg Kennedy, representative on the County Board District 5. My question is, it's sort of been addressed, but you had the people up at the top, and then you had the direct line with the people to the executive, and then down to the department heads, and then you had a separate legislative body.
Right.
Now, the legislative body also has direction to the people, so I guess my question is, the bridge, is there the bridge between county executive and legislator? The will of the people, I understood it as your picture, people, executive, department heads doing all the work, but the legislature does have some responsiveness to the people
Right.
in enacting laws, so
Right.
that's pretty much, if you could just shed some light.
That's important. That in a separation of power system, both institutions draw their authority from the people, and they have an interactive requirement. The executive does some things, the legislature does some things, and they're both. But the legislature can't say to the executive, "We have the authority of the people, you don't." So that's the fundamental difference in an elected executive system. Now, the legislature has powers, and if you look at the county charter, and you look at our county charter, I suggest you do that. There are lots of powers set out for the legislature, the fiscal powers being the most important. But let me give you an example from, very briefly, from the press recently. Our county executive offered a budget. We are in our fiscal year is the annual year in counties. So this budget is under consideration right now. It's going to be acted upon very shortly. It kept property taxes from increasing. It was politically appealing, and the head of the legislature said, "Good budget." You know, they hired a company to look at their budget, but didn't find any substantial things to say about it. Well, that legislature's not doing its job. There are policy goals in the legislative body that need to be accommodated in the budget. The executive might have done that consultatively, but I don't think so. The legislature should be doing a deep dive on some of those things. It should have been the whole year before been looking at the performance of departments and agencies to see if their performance was satisfactory from the legislature's point of view. They should have an information base, so things should be going in and coming out. You know, the head of the legislature, and he's a student of mine, a very smart guy, and so I tell him this, I'm not shy about it. The head of the legislature should never say on the first day that he's looking at the budget, we're happy with the budget, we're going to pass it. That legislature is not doing its job. It has authority from the people. It has, at the end of the day, it might only make marginal changes, but it should be capacity and will to do a serious judgment, analysis. Advice and consent. If somebody puts a person forward to head a department who you don't think is competent or capable, you should decline to allow that person to be appointed. And if the legislature asserts itself from time to time with regard to its powers, and I'm not trying to create, say, conflicts or conflicts sake, and institutionally it becomes efficacious. If it doesn't assert itself institutionally, it becomes marginal. And that's the point. There's a legislative powers in the document as well as executive powers. They derive from the people, so they should be used effectively. And what happens is you can get a collaborative government out of that. The executive can say, yes, the legislature is efficacious, I have to work with it. Rather than saying, I can do whatever I want because the legislature doesn't have the will or capacity to exercise its power.
Great, that's a great answer to that question. Yes, sir.
Dan Kroll, I'm the AllOTSEGO County Treasurer, and I'm ending my tenure so I can be a little more freewheeling with my language. My question is, does size matter? And what I mean by that is there a difference in the success of the executive model between the smaller counties that are doing that versus the large counties? Because one of your slides, I don't think it's an accident, but causation or correlation, the larger counties are the ones that have pursued that model so far. And when you look at the slide on the weaknesses of the executive model, they all seem to rest on the quality of that individual, which was the first point, but it flows down to the other ones that were under there. And if you have a community that arguably can't present at least two viable options for a candidate for that position, you have a higher risk of having a lower quality executive in that office. And it all depends on the size of the nonprofit, the business, the government sector that exists. So,
well, you're certainly, thank you for your service to county government. You're certainly right that the bigger places have gone for charters and the bigger by population, not by geographic expanse. And the smaller places have not. And the implication is also correct that certain structures are suitable, perfectly suitable to play, as I said at the outset. No single system is perfect for all places. It's contingent on values, goals, and so on. Objectively, county government is big business, even in small counties. So it's a large organization relative to organizational size generally. I don't know the budget of this county, but
100 million.
well, that's big. So there are probably not too many $100 million businesses in this county. And you'd ask yourself, do we require executive direction for a $100 million organization? Now, in some circumstances, you might not. But I think that this needs to be at least thought about and purposefully chosen. What you have thought about, purposely chosen. The reason that the more southern and larger counties are adopting executives is because bigger organizations are complex and require, essentially they require choice making across a range of functions that essentially deciding what not to do, deciding what to do less of, those are hard choices. So I think the insight is a good insight based on the data, but the objective circumstances of counties are big operations, even in small places.
I think given the hour, I wonder if Jerry could just comment on one more question. Might be a good way to wrap up. Given what you've learned about Otsego County, given what you've learned this morning from our questions, would you suggest that there was a natural next step based on your experience for all the people in this room and everyone who's responsible for the county to really consider?
Well, I heard somebody say that there were 30 years of consideration of alternative government structures, which is a long time. Even I'm 73, that would be like 40% of my life. That long time. But I think that having made a plan that indicates the goals of the government, the government should now say, let's seriously consider structure and do a report on whether we think a structural alternative needs to be formally pursued. So not go right to the formal process, but do an intermediate consultative process, maybe inside the government. And I would also ask the department heads what they think. Like the treasurer's here, there are other elected department heads and appointed department heads. Are they happy with the system? Are they frustrated with the system? Do they see other counties where they have peers doing the same work that have a directive, a more forceful central directive structure? And is that a good thing or not a good thing? Now, I think that might be. There might be some bias in that because people know what they know and they don't know what they don't know. But I think consultative process should include consideration of the people who have to operate in the structure.
So thank you. And let's give Dr. Benjamin another
final recognition, our honorary host, including Barbara Hamilton, who is here representing the AllOTSEGO Chamber of Commerce. And I did not want to end here without recognizing Dave Brenner, who is an honorary host. David did a complete study of this whole issue 10 years ago and made some very interesting recommendations at that point. Now, just as we finish here, again, thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Chair, who will be available to speak further with county representatives who wish to speak with him. There's a small lounge to one side here, and you folks can gather there if you wish. But Jerry will be available to answer additional questions. So again, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Jerry, thanks to Margaret, and